Hello and welcome to the 43rd edition of the GreenWave podcast by SYNI International. I'm SYNI, your host, and today's topic is our takeaway from the International Maritime Organisation meeting in London last week to promote a net zero agenda. Spoiler alert time. Delegates arrived with dense documents and finely tuned talking points and left with a familiar souvenir from multilateral life. The headline is simple. The IMO can has been kicked forward. The decision on a global fuel standard and a pricing instrument waits for 2026. The river outside the IMO headquarters looks calm on most mornings, even when the discussions inside are choppy. The extraordinary session of the Marine Environment Protection Committee that gathered from the 14th to the 17th of October did not adopt the net zero framework and agreed to reconvene in 12 months. The Working Group on Greenhouse Gas Reduction now refines the drafts and the guidance, while capitals weigh their red lines and their comfort zones. As with so many of these international conferences on sustainability, our first question is, should this be considered a success? In the narrow procedural sense, the meeting neither collapsed nor dissolved into open acrimony. Delegates preserved the draft architecture and preserved the forum to finish the job next year. That is a modest outcome. In the broader strategic sense, the week fell short of what industry, finance, and many coastal states wanted, which was legal certainty. The world did not wake up on the 18th of October with a binding schedule for global marine fuel decarbonisation or an agreed price on greenhouse gas pollution. That gap matters for investment models, for ship design choices, and for national energy strategies. A fair verdict is that the week was not a triumph and not a disaster. It was yet another pause with consequences. So why did delegates defer? The public narrative focuses on one forceful factor. The United States opposed a global carbon price and signalled retaliation against countries that moved ahead, while Saudi Arabia led the procedural motion to adjourn. The motion carried by a clear margin. The vote signalled that enough countries preferred delay to decision in the present political climate. Some states that had previously shown openness to pricing or had stayed in the room for price design stepped back to avoid a fracture. That coalition arithmetic produced a timeout rather than a text. Industry groups and civil society voiced disappointment and used the maritime version of a familiar metaphor. Uncertainty is expensive. There is more beneath the headline. Countries that are comfortable with levy structures wanted firm guardrails for revenue use and for equity. Countries that live with inflation concerns and supply chain anxiety wanted assurances that consumer price impacts remain modest and that any financial flows stay inside the sector. States that rely on fossil fuel export revenue wanted more time to test macroeconomic effects of a universal price signal. Countries with large registries kept an eye on competitiveness and on flag attractiveness. Every delegation carried a different balance of these pressures. A year preserves room to bargain across all these topics rather than absorb a losing result now and walk away with little leverage later. Next question. What exactly sits on the table in 2026? The proposed net zero framework couples a global fuel standard that tightens the carbon intensity of marine energy over time with a pricing mechanism that rewards fuels and operations with lower life cycle emissions and charges those that exceed the trajectory. The dual design matters. The standard sets the direction. The price accelerates compliance and funds the transition. Draft legal text exists. The working group continues to turn policy into operable guidance while the politics cool and rearrange. The framework is aligned with the 2023 strategy that orients shipping toward net zero around mid-century, with checkpoints in the 2030s and 2040s. None of this disappeared in London. All of it awaits adoption. In real terms, what are the implications for the shipping industry's commitment to climate goals. Commitment in shipping is an aggregate of many moving parts. There is the regulator at global level. There are regional regimes. There are financiers, insurers, ports, engine makers, fuel producers, and the charterers that decide which ships move cargo. A delay at the IMO weakens the central pillar and strengthens the motivation for regional action. Europe already prices maritime carbon through the emissions trading system and is phasing in coverage. That regional price sits on top of real cargo and real voyages today. The longer a global price remains pending, the more attractive it becomes for other regions to follow Europe's example or to set their own fuel mandates and subsidy schemes. Fragmentation grows when the centre stalls. That is not fatal for decarbonisation, yet it raises transaction costs and it blurs investment signals for global fleets that call at many ports. A second implication involves the tempo of fleet renewal. Shipyards and owners plan on long cycles. A firm global framework would de-risk orders for engines that burn green methanol, ammonia, or hydrogen derivatives, and it would de-risk the construction of bunkering infrastructure. Many first movers are already in the water and in the order book. A clear global rule would convert early steps into a fleet-wide pathway. In its absence, capital discipline remains selective. Owners evaluate charterer appetite route by route and fuel by fuel. Financial institutions adjust hurdle rates. Ports proceed with corridor projects where it makes sense and wait elsewhere. The result is still forward motion, yet with more friction than a universal instrument would deliver. A third implication reaches beyond the ship. A pricing mechanism at IMO level could capitalise a transition fund. It could lower the cost gap between fossil fuels and cleaner alternatives for a defined period while producers scale up. It could also finance training for seafarers and safety investments for novel fuels. Without it, public treasuries or private offtake deals must shoulder more of that early burden. Some governments will step up, some will not. We should expect uneven maps of progress across basins and cargo types until the global instrument lands. Now that the can has been kicked into 2026, where does this leave the sector? Shipping moves close to 90% of global trade by volume and contributes roughly 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The sector has lived for years with an expectation of global regulation rather than a patchwork. That expectation still exists, although patience is thinner. The conclusion in many boardrooms is that climate risk and transition risk do not wait for perfect policy. Many firms continue to build for a lower carbon future, and many customers demand it. The week in London did not reverse that direction. It only complicated the pathway to a common price and a common standard. Given our ongoing optimism for key industries to eventually do the right thing when it comes to sustainability, who are the players to watch over the coming year? Let's start with the coalitions that shaped the October outcome. The United States set a bright line against a global price and paired it with warnings of retaliation. The strength and durability of that stance will determine whether the 2026 session hosts a genuine negotiation or another deferral. We're essentially talking about the Trump administration pulling another lever in its climate hostility toolkit. The center of gravity inside the United States will likely stiffen the negotiating space. Next, watch Saudi Arabia, which tabled the successful motion to adjourn. Riyadh will remain pivotal in any conversation that links shipping rules with oil market strategy, with petrostate revenue dependence, and with geopolitical bargaining. The October session showed that procedural levers are as important as textual edits. Watch how that skill is deployed in 2026. Now, enter the good guys, the European Union and its member states. Europe entered the week ready to lock in the package. The EU's environmental leadership extends to shipping and also has functioning regional tools, including a carbon market that already covers maritime calls into European ports. The longer the global framework sits in draft, the more Europe will rely on regional pressure and on green corridor pacts with like-minded partners. The Union will also continue to craft its voting position and offer revenue-sharing concepts as bridges. Follow the Commission proposals and Council conclusions in the months leading to the reconvened session. Let's also pay attention to the Pacific and Caribbean small island developing states. For sure, this is a David versus Goliath scenario. Still, the Marshall Islands and the Solomon Islands seeded the levy idea years ago on a simple ethical and economic logic. Price the pollution and recycle proceeds to enable clean shipping and to support the most vulnerable. Those states and their allies will maintain moral clarity and technical discipline during the working group rounds. They will also continue to educate larger trading nations about the modest pass-through costs for consumers and the value of a predictable global instrument. That advocacy shapes the narrative far beyond their size. What about China, Japan, Brazil, and Singapore? Each carries a different blend of interests. China is a major exporter and a major clean energy manufacturer. It reads both sides of the ledger in any levy. Japan's maritime cluster is deep and technologically advanced, with serious work on ammonia-capable engines and safety standards. Brazil sets the tone for grain flows and for South Atlantic routes and seeks climate credibility. Singapore is the bunkering capital and a hub for maritime finance and arbitration. These countries often bridge between positions when a negotiation requires a landing zone. Their choices on abstentions or procedural motions can tilt outcomes. Their domestic pilots on fuels and safety will also determine what feels implementable in 2028, when the framework could begin to bite. Then there are the companies that can amplify or mute political signals. Large liner operators already deploy methanol-capable vessels and sign long-term green fuel offtakes. Engine makers scale dual-fuel platforms and certify new designs. Classification societies stress test safety cases for ammonia and hydrogen derivatives. Port authorities assemble corridors that guarantee fuel availability at both ends of a route. The presence of real ships on real schedules nudges ministers toward decisions. If the order book and the bunkering maps grow in 2025 and early 2026, the argument that industry stands ready will be hard to ignore. So, at the end of the day, what should we realistically expect in terms of progress headed into 2026? The working group should deliver more complete guidance on life cycle assessment for marine fuels. Proposals are likely on how to prevent double counting of emissions reductions when regional regimes coexist with the global instrument. We should also see draft rules on monitoring, reporting, and verification that align with the price signal, along with safety and training texts for crews that will handle novel fuels at sea and in port. These are the quiet tasks that make law usable rather than decorative. One takeaway from the can kick into 2026 is an expectation of more regional action. Europe's carbon market for shipping continues its phase-in and creates a price floor for voyages that touch European ports. Other jurisdictions will explore similar steps or will leverage port-state control to nudge cleaner fuels on specific trades. Some nations may offer production credits for green methanol or green ammonia tied to maritime offtake. Some may use public banks to back first-of-a-kind bunkering project. The map will darken in places where policy entrepreneurs move first and where customers are willing to pay for lower carbon transport. Another likely outcome is a more vocal coalition of cargo owners. The quiet power in shipping sits with companies that buy slots. If they specify emissions intensity in tenders or reward verified low-carbon voyages with longer contracts and better rates, the message reaches the fleet overnight. Many consumer brands and heavy industry players have net zero plans that depend on transport decarbonisation. As the 2026 vote approaches, expect them to make the investment case loudly and in public, and to pair it with a request for regulatory certainty. As frequently is the case in the sustainable world, pricing design will remain one of the hardest problems politically and the most important economically. The argument will not be about whether price works as an accelerator. Economists agree on that point, and industry experience in other sectors confirms it. The argument will be about the right level, the right ramp, the right distribution of proceeds, and the right way to recognise early action. The more the working group can arrive with a package that answers fairness concerns while still creating a meaningful signal, the more likely an adoption vote becomes. So how would advocates of sustainability like the shipping industry to behave during the pause? Simple. Keep building toward credible compliance in 2028. If the framework is adopted next year, entry into force remains earliest in 2028, and firms that act now will harvest the learning curve and the first mover advantage. Focus on the fuels that can scale with credible life cycle emissions. Green methanol is already at sea and can absorb more capacity, especially for container trades with predictable schedules. Ammonia propulsion is moving through design and safety regimes and will suit bulkers and tankers on longer hauls once bunkering appears at both ends. Synthetic fuels will advance where renewable electricity is plentiful. Blend operational measures with technology. Slow steaming, weather routing, and advanced hull coatings cut fuel use today and create a compound benefit when paired with cleaner energy. There is also the issue of what ports should do. Once again, keep it simple. Build the confidence loop. Signal dates when specific fuels will be available in pilot quantities. Install shore power where the grid allows and where the local emissions benefit justifies it. Partner with energy producers and ship owners on green corridor agreements that guarantee both supply and demand on defined routes. Use visibility to reduce perceived risk for private capital. Every corridor that moves from press release to first bunkering reduces the sense of novelty for the next one. Of course, regulators are everyone's favourite, and the question remains what they should do during the interval. In the simplest terms, maintain momentum through clarity. Communicate the elements of the framework that are settled and the areas where genuine compromise is still needed. Publish model revenue use arrangements that satisfy fairness concerns and protect against diversion. Encourage early action by recognising it in 2028 compliance rules. Resist reopenings of settled text that only serve to relitigate the 2025 debate. This is a moment for institutional patience that also signals that time has value. Each incremental signal reduces the option value of delay. Finally, what are the biggest risks in the next 12 months? Geopolitics is the first, especially with the Donald lurking. If major economies escalate trade disputes, a global instrument becomes harder to adopt. Macroeconomics is the second. Inflationary spikes revive fears about cost pass-through and can be misused to defeat a levy that in practice has modest consumer impacts. Safety is the third. A high-profile incident involving a novel fuel would slow acceptance and justify caution. The answer to each risk is preparation. Negotiators can box trade issues away from technical work. Policymakers can pre-brief on price impacts using transparent numbers. Industry can overinvest in safety management systems, training, and community engagement at ports where new fuels will be handled. Listeners might ask whether shipping remains committed to climate goals after a week like this. The answer lives in actions rather than statements. New build orders that enable low-carbon fuels continue to flow. Charter parties that specify emissions intensity are spreading. Banks assess transition risk and apply it to lending and charter coverage. Ports sign corridor agreements and start putting steel in the ground. None of this slows because a vote moved to next year. What does slow is the universalization of these practices across the entire fleet. The price signal and the fuel standard are the tools that take decarbonization from leadership examples to mainstream behavior. That is why adoption in 2026 still matters. A final thought for our community of analysts and practitioners. The history of maritime regulation is a history of thresholds that looked impossible until they became routine. Double hulls, the global sulfur cap, electronic navigation are great examples. Each change met with cost forecasts that later looked inflated once scale and experience brought costs down. The net zero framework aims to do the same for fuel choice and for emissions. The calendar now shows one more year on the runway. That is long enough to prepare and short enough to demand discipline. The sector that carries most of world trade can steer on a steady bearing when the signal arrives. The irony of delay is that it gives those who are serious a chance to arrive first. Well, that's a wrap on our 43rd GreenWave podcast episode. We love that you have shared your time with us. Finding us is easy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, Podchaser, Boomplay, and Player FM. Follow the pod, share with friends, and leave a review. If you have missed any of our LinkedIn posts or the GreenWave Gazette, catch us on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, Instagram, or visit synergy-international.net. We'll keep reflecting on the trends shaping sustainable finance and global policy. Until next time, keep riding the green wave of sustainability.